Hello everyone, this is Raptorial, and I've got some stories. I was having a bit of a debate with a creationist on Quora last night. It began with me posting an answer to someone's question of, what is the definition of a species? Read word for word. The question was, what makes an organism count as a whole new species? Where is the line that says, this isn't a Tyrannosaurus Rex, this is a chicken? What distinguishes the threshold between what's one species versus what's another species? And seeing as I like answering ecological and paleontological questions on Quora, I wrote a several paragraph answer to it. Then, a little bit later on, I got a comment response that gave a long and convoluted argument against the hypothesis of evolution. Evolution is more of a never falsified law of natural science than a hypothesis, but I used the hypothesis term quite a lot in my first explanation, so they kind of ran with that, even though it's not quite right. But so the hypothesis, as this person called it, to which I responded with another several paragraphs, and he responded back, and so on, until we had exchanged arguments about 3 times each, so about 6 or 7 multiple paragraphs. I'll link to the Quora page where this took place. The conversation by comments that we had is pretty interesting, but ultimately this person went where I suspected he was going in the first place, trying to say that since I can't 100% prove that evolution works in the way that natural science describes, it must then be wrong, and that life must be the result of creation. Now, I had not begun with anything other than trying to give an answer as to what the definition for a distinct species is, according to evolutionary science. So I was surprised that this commenter, who might not be the same person who posted the initial question, so I didn't intend it to follow this line, but responding to the commenter, it did. And I think I ultimately won the debate. Now, I actually encountered a person when I was volunteering for the Natural History Museum who came up to me as I was managing the vertebrate paleontology exhibit table during our Archaeology and Earth Science Day, one of the event days where each of the departments, research departments, has exhibit tables set up, and the scientists, staff, and volunteers speak with the crowds of guests about the fossils and, well, also whatever else they want to talk about. In fact, I remember a couple of years back, this little girl came up talking to me about predatory animals and Zootopia, and she and I had a fun little conversation. Kids are amazingly inquisitive when you learn to appreciate them, and when you learn to have conversations about topics that they enjoy. So last October, at this Archaeology and Earth Science event day, this guy came up to the vertebrate paleontology table as I was managing it. Everyone else in Vert Paleo was, I think, at lunch at the time, so I was on my own for about an hour. Usually there's 2 or 3 people at a table, or 2 tables, but anyway. He started asking me how I got involved in evolutionary science. I answered, I've been interested in ecology and evolution since I was a very small boy. When I would go to the library, I would make a beeline straight for the nonfiction section and just devour the books about geology, ecology, evolution, astronomy, paleontology, all the natural sciences. I loved them. And then when I was 8 years old, Jurassic Park was released in theaters. I went to go see it and instantly fell in love with the velociraptors. So evolutionary science has been a passion of mine ever since. So this guy who came up to me started asking me questions afterwards about how I believed evolution works, and he began countering with stories of God and creation. Now he and I, this person I talked to in person, it was not the same commenter, but this was kind of out of the blue, that it was another conversation that I wasn't expecting. But he and I actually had a very cordial and interesting discussion. He eventually had to leave. He had 3 or 4 young kids who couldn't, even for the love of God, stay in one place in the museum. They wanted to explore. They wanted to run around, just like all children want to do. And so he had to go catch up with them. Hope he was able to catch up with all of them. I remember going to the museum when my siblings were very little, and each of the big kids would kind of have to each stick with one little kid because they would go in completely different directions. And so, trying to be either one big kid or one parent trying to keep up with several little kids is, well, that'll make you pray to God that you can. That'll wear you out. So anyway, this back and forth conversation on Quora is not the first time I've been surprised by someone just bringing this up to me out of the blue. I was just answering questions and had no idea it was going to go this way. It's okay. It's just that if Christians want to convert me, they're not going to be able to do so by trying to dismantle evolutionary science in front of me. That won't work. Evolution, ecology, geology, things like plate tectonics, it explain too much about how the natural world works, and too well. It would work much better if you wanted to introduce me or any... Oh boy, the world fell down. No. It's held up by tape. I need to get a frame. I'll try to lift the world up in a little while. Anyway. So, you're trying to introduce me to Christianity, just to talk about how you would go about possibly converting an atheist to it. It would be much better to talk from a moral and life and community structure angle, because that is something that has been missing from my life, from a lot of our lives, sadly, from the millennials and how they were treated. That's a whole nother topic from where I'm going to go tonight. My parents completely failed to raise their children in a stable and constructive family environment. And I would be open to joining a church community for the purpose of having that structure that was shattered when my parents divorced. I was 8 years old. My first sister was... No, sorry. I was 10 years old. My first sister, all 4 siblings are younger than me. My first sister was 8. I was 8 years old when I saw Jurassic Park. 2 years later, my parents divorced. Okay, so at the time of the divorce, I was 10. My first sister was 8. Second sister was a baby. And the other 2 half-siblings, the 2 half-siblings hadn't been born yet. What stops me from going to join a church is, there's a couple of things. One is I'm trying to find a good community to join. There's only strange ones like Scientology and Mormonism in my immediate vicinity where I live, and those aren't going to pull me in. And it also won't work to bring me in by attacking evolutionary science. That's the wrong direction to come from Christians. Oh, and there is one other motive I have for remaining atheist, and that is to symbolically give Islam the finger. Since Islam in its doctrine considers atheists to be the worst of the worst people, but when that's what I'm viewed as by a scripture that preaches child marriage and acid attacks and intolerance towards being questioned or scrutinized at all, I wear the badge of opposing that doctrine, of opposing Islam with pride. And this actually leads me to the next topic I wanted to bring up. While looking through links and questions on Quora, I was drawn attention to this article about a woman from the United Arab Emirates who fled to Macedonia and is begging for asylum in a Western country. And this is not long after the story of the, I think, 18-year-old Saudi woman. The first name was Rahaf. I forget the rest of her name. Rahaf, who barricaded herself in her apartment and used social media to draw attention to her efforts to escape from a forced marriage to seek asylum in Canada, and she was in fact accepted and lives in Canada now. Though I wonder how she's getting used to the winter. The winter this year in the American Midwest and Canada has been very cold. We had that polar vortex in January and, well, the end of January, I think. And then we had some warm days, then we had some cold days again, then a couple mild days, now snowing again. It's been back and forth and back and forth. More cold days than warm days, though the warm days in between tend to be surprisingly warm. In any case, I gotta tell you, as an American, it's really frustrating to see what looks like this increasing trend of women trying to escape marriages, and so we'll talk about the next one in a minute, but asking for asylum in the West. And there are several reasons to that, but I'll read a little bit from the article first. So this article, and I'll link to it if my computer doesn't lose the IP address. Article was written by Bianca Britton at CNN. Oh, the CNN who calls President Trump and his supporters murderous, misogynist, racist, and every other horrible name. Yeah, CNN has a lot of respect for the culture that treats its women the best in the world and the countries that everyone wants to come to. Apparently this woman's name is, if I pronounce it right, I don't care, I'm just guessing, Hind Mohammed al-Baluchi, 42 years old, from Dubai, fled after her family threatened her when she sought a divorce from her husband, left her 4 children behind as she escaped to Macedonia. She said, "I am a mother of 4 children. No mother would leave her kids just like this, but I had to leave my kids. I had no choice." Well, I am very much aware that women's rights are effectively non-existent in Muslim countries, specifically Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But she still technically did have a choice. She could have chosen to do what she could to protect her children from whatever is going on in her family. Because I gotta tell you something, when there is abuse in the family, the children are not spared. There is almost never, I shouldn't say the chance is absolute 0, but it's pretty close. There's almost never mistreatment going on between the adults that the children aren't also on the receiving end of. The article says, in a video recorded in December before her arrest, al-Baluchi said her family did not approve of her seeking a divorce because it would affect their reputation. "They don't want their name to be spoiled," she said. Now, while I'm not an expert in Islamic family relations, I have definitely encountered this before. There is, in Islamic culture, this deranged concept of what honor is, much of it based on the young women not having relations outside the faith, the ethnic group, before marriage, which is often arranged when the girls are still very young, prepubescent even, and the marriages have to be agreed to by the family. The men are indisputable masters of the family. A woman has to bring, in Sharia law, 4 male witnesses to support any claim of sexual misconduct. And you can guess how often that works out. And at the same time, molestation of children is extremely common and even encouraged when they move to non-Islamic countries, because apart from the command to conquer all other countries to build a global Islamic caliphate, which if that ever happens, it's over for any hope of happy childhoods ever again. They view non-Muslims as not even human. It's hard to say this, but that's the truth. I know people don't like facing it, but that doesn't mean it's not the truth. I was watching not long ago a conversation between Ann Coulter and an audience, I think in the United Kingdom, where she spoke of legal cases she had observed, one of them being a Muslim family living in the Midwest United States, who had a daughter in her early teens who was dating a black boy. And the family found out, considered this to be a huge embarrassment to the family. And so when the girl came home one day, the mother held her down to the floor while the father stabbed her to death. Now, outside of truly outlier level insane people, that is not something that Western families do to their children. Mind you, there are a lot of ways in which Western parents need to improve the way they treat their kids, but at least in the West, we don't murder our children in cold blood for dating someone we disapprove of. Saying that kind of treatment of innocent children and teenagers, seeing and learning about that kind of horrific treatment of innocent children and teenagers makes me shudder. And it makes me shudder would be 1,000 times an understatement. I also remember another case. This time I read this in a Cultures of the World textbook of a Muslim family in America that had married their early teens aged daughter, maybe even younger, to a much older man. And of course the marriage was consummated that night. And the question posed in the text was this: in a case of a clash of cultural practices, this being the girl was way below the age of consent, sexual consent in any state in America, as well as below marrying age for sure, and yet in Islamic tradition this is not anything unusual, does the West allow this to take place or does it not? Well, what are people in the West told? That when you travel to and live in a country different from the one you came from, you need to learn what is and what is not acceptable in the new country. So it would seem to me that that should go both ways. So no, that marriage should have been stopped in its tracks. Should not have been allowed by America. No child marriage in the West at all. I don't care if it's an Islamic cultural norm. You don't get to do it in America, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, or any other Western culture nation. And if this is a problem for Muslim families, they don't get to come to the West and bring that here. And the West should damn well have held that line. That and many other lines as well. But the politicians of the West, in particular the EU and the UN, want to build a single world government, and so are trying to flood the West with Muslim and African migrants who will vote to keep the big governments in power against the wishes and against the consent of the native Western populations. And the nation's own mainstream medias are portraying anyone who opposes these invasions as, well, you've heard the names 1,000 times. Racists, bigots, Islamophobes. It's so repetitive that we know almost every despicable name we're called by heart, which is a very tragic commentary in and of itself. You see, white people and white men in particular, don't like big governments because we've learned how destructive and oppressive they are. And we have the intellect and skepticism necessary to question the government, to know full well that history can repeat itself when governments bloat. In fact, we hold the ability to question state power as one of the necessities of building a free nation. So for that reason, the governments are out to get us. They are using worldwide media to portray false narratives, which, even though they're very false, get a lot of attention in order to do it. So if any demographic is under completely disproportionate assault and persecution, it's white Western men, Jewish and Christian white men in particular. Even though I'm an atheist and have my issues with creationism, I am fully aware of the unfounded hatred thrown at Jews and Christians, and I condemn that. Leave the synagogues and the churches alone. Although I will say Pope Francis is a real problem and should be replaced by a more virtuous and conservative pope. So I suspected that this was coming. After the first few Muslim women took to Twitter and other social media to seek refuge in the USA, Canada, Australia, and other Western countries, we'd soon see a lot more. This woman, Hind Mohammed Abaluki, left her children behind to who knows what fate because she was unhappy with her marriage. And I know marriage law is brutal in the Middle East to women, but it is not the responsibility of Europe or Australia or North America to fix that. I mean, we're slandered as racists every time we try to address the injustices of Islam. So until that stops, don't ask us to grant asylum to everyone who's having difficulty in the world, especially when they abandon their children. And it's especially irritating to white Western men. While I have a base level of sympathy for people in these really tough situations, the fact that she left her children behind means that my sympathy is going to remain very low. North America and Europe have been forced, not only in recent decades, but it's been built up to over many decades, though it's in the past 15 that it's really skyrocketed, forced to take in tens of thousands of migrants from Africa and the Middle East who make no attempts to assimilate to Western culture, have no respect for Western law, and who feel they can flee here claiming asylum or refugee status, when in truth very few of them actually fit the conditions for refugee status or asylum. And as a result, the countries that have treated women and immigrants historically with the most tolerance that any country ever has before are now collapsing from multicultural overload. And at the same time, white males who built the most tolerant nations that have ever existed are scorned and slandered around every corner. They're called bigoted white patriarchs even when not enough of any sort of patriarchy remains to even protect young boys from being drugged and ridiculed in the schools. Many of them are raised by single mothers who divorce the boys' fathers for petty reasons. The boys experience terrible family lives, and when they ask for even the slightest consideration of their needs and experiences, they are shouted down and treated even worse. There's no appreciation for the men who worked very hard to build the most free and welcoming countries that have treated women and children the very best, and who actually take pride in treating their women and children well. And yet, as we've seen in recent years, if not decades, a lot of women using the language of the language of compassion, though not actually paying attention to the consequences, welcome with open arms people from far more brutal countries, and it is really frustrating and completely ungrateful to the men who are trying to protect their families from the drug traffickers, from the rapists. Sorry. Although a lot of people in other countries are racist against other ethnic groups. I mean, you go to Africa, and most of the a lot of the people, a lot of the people in actually consider themselves members of separate ethnic groups and tribes rather than other countries. So, and the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims have been waging war against each other for 1,000 years. All the while, the Western and specifically white Western Judeo-Christian men worked hard to build and expect of others when they come to their countries to adhere to universal moral principles and behavior. And we have found our families destroyed, our borders invaded. We're struggling to find work. We're struggling to build new families. We're struggling to stay even the least bit motivated to hold up the free and rational world, only not wanting to let go of it because if we do, the result is true, utter chaos and suffering. So yeah, this makes me angry that women from parts of the world where they are truly oppressed use social media to cry to the West, the already overloaded West. Some of them are allowed to come in and seek asylum, yet no respect is shown to the men who are trying to defend their countries. That these women are seeking to escape truly barbaric cultures, many of them leaving their own children behind, which is parental abandonment. I'm sorry that their countries are so brutal. Maybe if the white Western world was actually appreciated and not scorned and invaded, we might have continued to be welcoming. But that sentiment of welcome is shutting down for reasons of sheer over-exploitation. While the Western world is going to need several decades to revive its identity and pride in its role in the world before we take in anyone else. We can't rescue the whole world. We can't fix the whole world. Especially not with hundreds of millions of people, many within our own borders and our own governments trying to dismantle the free world. There's this frustrating contradiction about the West coming from the rest of the world. You want the West to exist so that you can flee there when you're having trouble in your own countries or because you want its perks and free stuff. But you also want to claim that it is a racist, bigoted world that needs to let in other people so it can be more diverse and tolerant. But that is not how tolerance works. Tolerance comes from mutual respect. The respect has to come from both directions, has to go both ways. And if you move to the West, you should assimilate to the West. And there's a few who do, but not the sheer numbers of people looking to mooch off of the free cultures that took thousands of years to build and defend until we were betrayed by our own governments. You can't have that, people. You can't have that contradiction. You can't have it both ways. White men don't want the borders around their countries closed because they're racist. We want the borders closed because we want to work on saving our own cultures and preserving our own families for a while. So I'm sorry, but I would say no more refugees from the third world. No more asylum. And definitely no more taking in adults who leave their children behind or are trying to come in with children who are not verifiably their own, because we've seen from moving up from Mexico and Central America that that's going on quite a bit too. There is an ungodly scale of slander and hate directed at Judaism and Christianity from Western governments, mostly from the left, but I mean, the right is cowardly and not defending the native Western religion as they should be. Just look at what happened to the Covington Catholic high school kids. You know, plenty of people on the right turned against them, just as almost everyone on the left. But this has been my problem with the right for a while. They don't have the guts to stand up against the left for the values, and they let the left get too much power. They've done a very poor job in speaking from a language of morality, and they should have learned how to do that. Unjustified attacks are also, I regret to say, coming from the sciences and from environmentalist movements, though the environmentalist movements are more directly going after freedom and the industrial economy, without very many people pushing environmentalism, understanding what they're talking about. The corruption of the sciences, many of them the sciences that I studied to go into myself, by politics came to me as a gigantic betrayal of reason when I learned how truly bad it was. I mean, I knew it was going on many years ago. I didn't realize it had gotten pretty much taken over the sciences, and it's why I'm not going back to school to seek a graduate degree. I just can't go into the sciences through the universities anymore. I may be an atheist, but I want Judaism and Christianity to stay strong as allies against Islam. We are soon going to need all the allies we can get. All of us. And I have deep respect for the structure and values that the Judeo-Christian tradition provides. They just need to stay away from tearing down evolution. That is going to turn a lot of people who hold it as a passion away. And I'm not sure that the Judeo-Christian world can afford to do that anymore. So that's all for tonight. I hope you think about what I've said, think on these lessons, and I'll be back before long. Bye.